today is about determinate and indeterminate force system and the different uses of these ones. So when you say a statistically determinate force system is the one where it's possible to calculate the applied forces and the moment, and therefore we will be able to predict to a certain extent the resultant tooth movement. So basically in this kind of determinate force system, we'll be able to know exactly the force, the moment, and then exactly knowing where the tooth is going to go. So to have a determinate system in orthodontics, a couple force can be applied only on one attachment, and on the other side it would not be a couple force, it will just be a single point of a force attachment. So if you look at the figure here, you can see that we have a rectangular wire going in a rectangular slot that will result in a couple force. Now if this tooth is going to go into the bracket, that will be another rectangular wire in a rectangular slot, which will result in a two couple forces. That will not be now a determinate system, because that would be too complicated to calculate. So instead of tying this wire into the bracket, no, we tie it like this to be a single point of a force attachment, no couple at all. So it will be one couple here, no couple here. We call it one couple system. These cases it will be determinate, and we will be able to calculate the moment and the force and predict exactly where is the tooth movement going to be. Now when we do this, we try to splint the teeth as one unit. As you can see here, we have from the canine to the 6, and then we're going to have a TPA connecting these two to the other side. So you're going to have the posterior teeth as a one segment, as a one unit. So then when you are dealing with it, you are dealing with it as a one center of resistance. So that be as a one unit with one center of resistance, and then as another single point of a force attachment. That's how the determinate system works. And this is, guys, notes that we just described. Now the indeterminate system, that the force will be too complex to precisely calculate the forces and the moment involved. However, we can be only able to detect the direction of the net moment and the approximate net force in the indeterminate system. So while in the determinate system, we'll be able to exactly know what is the force, what is the amount of the force, the moment, the net moment, and then what is the direction of the tooth movement. Here, we will be only able to decide the direction of the moment, all right, the net direction of the moment, and the approximate amount of force when it's an indeterminate system. And as you can see here, we have this wire here that going in a rectangular wire, going in a rectangular slot in the posterior teeth, and then it goes again to a rectangular slot in the bracket in the front. So that will be couple force here, couple force here. Now it's too complicated. That's an indeterminate system. So we're going to start with examples of the statistically determinate system. So basically, if you have an intrusion wire like we see here, so basically you have the arch wire, and this arch wire is a rectangular wire inserted to a rectangular slot, and then you tie this wire into the bracket without engaging the bracket itself. So again, without engaging the rectangular slot, because the moment you are engaging the rectangular slot, that means that you are having a couple system, and that will be indeterminate. So now, rectangular slot, the wire is engaging here, we need to do intrusion. So we are estimate the amount of the force to be 40 gram, 10 gram for each tooth of the four incisors. So if you're going to look at per side, that will be 20 gram on this side and 20 gram on the other side. For example, this is the right side 20 gram, the left side 20 gram. Now the distance between the point of the force application to the molar is 30 millimeter. So if you want to calculate the amount of the moment that is generated, that will be 20 gram, which is the force applied per side, multiplied by the distance. That will generate a 600 gram millimeter of moment that will rotate this molar distally in the distal direction. Now, if you go to the incisors, we are applying the force away from the center of resistance by 5 millimeter. So here the molar, here is the center of resistance. The distance from the center of resistance to the point of the force application was 30 millimeter, and that's why we have a huge amount of moment generated on the molars. However, in the incisors, the point of the force application is here, the center of resistance is here, so we have a 5 millimeter difference. Now, we are applying a 20 gram per side, right? So in each side, the amount of the moment that will be generated equal to 5 millimeter multiplied by 20 gram of force. That will be 200 gram millimeter of a moment generated to the incisors. So that's about so what's going to happen when you do intrusion? With the intrusion, we're going to have a proclination of the incisors. And this is something important to know and understand. Because when you do intrusion, because we are applying the force anterior to the center of resistance, we will get proclination as well as intrusion. And that's very important to understand. And we're going to get rotation of, distal rotation of the molars and slight extrusion as well. So this is a determinate system. I'm able now to detect all the forces, how much is the amount of the force, what is the direction of the movement. That's what we just discussed. Then the opposite to the intrusion one is the extrusion arch wire. So it's the same. We have an arch wire that you're using it to extrude this canine. So you are applying the force which needs to do extrusion, which is 50 gram. And then the point of the force application is here. It's far away from the molars, about 20 millimeter. So if you're going to measure the amount of the moment generated to the molar, that will be 20 multiplied by 50. That will be 1000 gram millimeter moment of a distal rotation as well. So now we are knowing that we're going to extrude the canine, but what's going to happen is intrusion to the molar and rotation in the counterclockwise rotation, as we can see in this direction. So the distal cusp will move occlusally while the mesial cusp will go gingivally. If you look now straight, it's the same patient, but still now I'm looking straight. The canine is palatally impacted. This is the central of rotation, and you are applying the force more labial into the central of, or like in a more, let's say, more outward to the center of resistance. This is more medial, this is more distal, or we can say more lateral. So the applying the force more toward the line of the arch compared to the center of resistance. So what's going to do is you're going to apply the force here away from the center of resistance by 5 millimeter. That will result in a counterclockwise rotation of the canine. So the canine crown will go more palatally. And the amount of the moment that will be generated is equal to the force multiplied by the distance, which is 5 millimeter multiplied by 50. That's 250 gram millimeter, the amount of the rotation that we're expecting. Again, you are applying the force that will result in extrusion to the canine. It's the same force will result in intrusion as well of the molars. Now, when you are intruding this molar, you are applying the force here. So the force now is away from the center of resistance by 5 millimeter. So that will result in as well a rotation on the clockwise rotation, or the molars will rotate buccally because we are applying the force out of the center of resistance. So now we are kind of understanding exactly what are the forces when we do extrusion. This tooth will have intrusion and rotation in the counterclockwise direction. Canine will be intruded and it will rotate it as well, go palatally, while the molars will flare buccally as well. That's again a determinate system of the force. Now we go now to the indeterminate system. So the indeterminate system, as we mentioned, now we have two couple forces or even more. But the thing is, it's not anymore one couple and one single point of attachment. And here we can't know exactly the moments and the force as we did before. We might be able to guess the net moment and the approximate force that is happening. So we're starting with the utility arch wire that are using for intrusion. Now, it's the same principle. Now, the one we used before in the determinate system, that the wire does not go into the slot of the bracket. While in this case here, the wire will go into the bracket into the slot of the bracket. So we have a rectangular wire here, we have a rectangular wire here. Now, as you can see, we can't tell you how much is the moment, how much is the force applied. We just tell you the direction of the net moment. So you are applying an intrusive force here. The force is applied labial to the center of resistance. So that will result in intrusion as well as rotation in this direction. So we're going to have rotation in the labial direction. The crown will go labially and the root will go lingually. Now, if you are using a rectangular wire, you might be able to apply torque to counteract this movement, as we can see here. So if you are applying lingual crown torque, that will be counteracting the amount of the moment that is generated due to the rotation. So again, we're applying the force here. Let's stay for this one now in the figure A. We are applying the intrusion forces that will result in intrusion as well as labial rotation of the crown and lingual rotation of the root. The same thing will happen to the molar. It will go distal tipping of the molars as the counter movement. Now, if I don't want this rotation, I want to reduce this amount of rotation, simply what I can do is apply lingually crown torque to the bracket. So when you do the intrusion, we're going to have a rotation in the labial direction of the crown. This one will be counteracted by the moment that is generated by the lingually crown torque that we are applying. So at the end, instead of having only instead of having intrusion, we're going to have instead of having intrusion and proclination, we're going to have only intrusion, and that's the one that we want. But in order to do that, the counter moment that we generated with the couple force with the lingual torque should be equal to the amount of the torque that is generated by the force that is causing the intrusion. Another method is simply to do cinch back of the arch wire. So if you do cinch back of the arch wire, and then we are doing intrusion. So what's going to happen when you apply the force anterior to the center of resistance, the lower incisors will try to procline. But because you are cinching back the wire, you are preventing this from happening. So what's going to happen now, that the teeth will try to procline, but they can't, and they will intrude instead. Now, having said that when the incisors try to procline, they will move the molar mesially with them, because that's the anchor point. So the lower incisors are trying to move forward and they are attached to the molar. So what's going to happen? The molar is going to move mesially and the teeth will intrude without proclination if the molar was strong enough not to move mesially. So this kind of tell you how the utility arch wire working. And then we have the V-bend, and we have symmetrical and asymmetrical V-bend. And we need to know when you're using V-bend, it depends on the length of the arm. Now, if this arm is shorter, that means you're applying more moment at that tooth. And if this arm is longer, you are applying less moment. So basically, it's the other way around. If the arm is longer, you are applying more moment, which makes sense, because when the arm is longer, you get more distance from the point of force application and you get more moment. When the arm is shorter, you get less moment. So if you want to have equal amount of movement but opposite in direction, you have to place the V-bend in the middle, as you can see here exactly. So when I do this one, the molar on the right side will rotate buccally. The crown will go buccally and the root will go lingually, and the same thing will happen to the molar on the opposite side. Now, because the V-bend is in the middle, the amount of the force are equal, so they will cancel each other, and the result will be only rotation of these molars. Now, when you have a molar and incisor, the size of the teeth is different, so the resistance for the tooth movement is different. For that reason, when you apply the moment, this tooth we need to apply more moment compared to this one. So for that reason, this tooth has to rotate in this direction, in a counterclockwise rotation, and this one in a clockwise rotation. Then we have what we call it the step bends. So when you have the step bend, now the difference between the step bend and the V-bend, that in the V-bend, you need to be specific about the location of the bend. While the step bend, you can position it wherever you want. It's going to give you the same effect. So when you have a step bend here, as you can see, that will result in correcting the angulation of the tooth. So what we're going to have is rotation in the mesial direction. in this one and this one as well. So the root will go mesially and the crown will go distally. However, it again does not depend on the location of the step bend. Now there is something that you need to understand, which we call it the interbracket span. Now, does the interbracket span has a relationship to the amount of the force that is generated? The answer is yes. So let's look at this paragraph. If you notice now, the wire is bended and bypassing the premolars and canine and then engaging the incisors. So have you ever thought, why are we doing this? Why not go to the canine and then bend the wire as we wanted it to be? Why we are bypassing these incisors? The reason is what we call it the interbracket span. So the research have found that if you use a step bend that is about 35.35 millimeter, with a distance of interbracket span of a 7 millimeter, the force that is resulted, it will be 347 grams. If you increase this interbracket span into 14 millimeter, the force will drop into 43. When we say interbracket span, we are talking about this distance. So now, when you're using this utility arch wire, the interbracket span is from here all the way to here, which is very long. That will result in a reduction of the force. And as you know, when we do intrusion, we want light continuous force. That's what we need when you're doing intrusion. So I want everything to be done to produce a lighter force. And that's why we're doing this bypassing. So when you increase the interbracket span, the amount of the force will be reduced. Now, another thing to talk about is the two-couple arch wire to change the incisor inclination. So, if you are using an arch wire here and you do an intrusion, like to these incisors, now we are applying the force. We have a rectangular wire here as well. It's the same. Now, when I'm placing the arch wire, it's going to be an indeterminate system, but I am applying the force anterior to the center of resistance. That will result in a proclination of the incisors. Now, if I don't want the proclination, simply I will do cinch back of the arch wire. The crown can't move mesially, but the root will go, the crown can't move buccally, but the root will go in the palatal direction. It will rotate in this direction. So the root will go palatally, as if you're applying palatal root torque. But that will be on the expense of the losing anchorage for the molars to moving forward, because when you splint the teeth, then the crown, the root will try to go palatally, and that will result in pushing the molars forward, so we could lose anchorage. And here person advocated this mechanics that he used to correct the torque of the incisors when you have a class 2 division 2 malocclusion. So what he recommended, that you get a very rigid 1925 stainless steel arch wire, and then you bend this wire. As you can see, it goes to the incisors and then bend them around the brackets of the central incisors and go back, and it has to be tightly adapted. And then you get a spring wire like this one with a rectangular wire that is going attached just mesial to the sixes, and you cinch definitely this wire back. So what's going to happen now, this is going to act like an intrusion arch wire. It will go apply a force that is labial to the center of resistance. That will result in a proclination of the incisors and moving palatally of the root of the central incisor. But because this wire is very rigid and is adapted to the labial surface, this wire will prevent the incisor from moving forward. So instead, what's going to happen? Intrusion and the root will go palatally. So you correct the torque of the incisors and you correct the class 2 division 2. But this is again on the expense of the molars, because whenever we cinch the wire back, that means that all the load is in the molar might move mesially. So if you wanted to do this mechanics, that's excellent. But if you are tied with anchorage, I mean AB anchorage, you need to make sure to reinforce your anchorage and hold the molars to prevent them from moving forward. You were talking about the posterior crossbite correction or the transverse movement. So when you do expansion of the arch wire, if you attach the wire to the premolars, again, we're going to have a small interbracket span, and then the amount of the force will be increased. So when you do expansion with the arch wire to expand the sixes, it's preferred if you're not engaging the premolars, and you do the bend just distal to the canine, and that will push the crown outside. Now, if you notice here, the crown will go just outside. Now, if you don't want that and you want to rotate it, you do what we call it the toe-end bend. So the mesial side of the crown will go out and the distal side will go in, and that helps in the correction of the crossbite. Now, when you use a lingual arch, like in the transpalatal arch or the lingual arch, that will be used to correct the rotation sometimes. It can be used in a two-couple system to correct the rotation. How is that? So if you notice here in the palatal side of the insert, like a TPO for example, you have a horizontal slot here and a horizontal slot here. So you do bend of the wire on this way and bend on the wire on this way, and then you engage it to the brackets, and this will be a bilateral bend. So what's going to happen, this tooth will rotate it in this direction, so the distal cusp will go outside, the mesial cusp will go outside on this way, and that will happen, the opposite will happen on the opposite side. It will rotate it in this direction. So in this side here, the mesial cusp will go outside, and here, sorry, the other tooth, the contralateral tooth, the mesial cusp will go outside and the distal cusp will go inside. So these will have equal amount of forces, they will cancel each other, and the results will be only the moment. These cases are helpful to correct the rotation of the molar. If you have a bilateral rotation of the molar, that will be helpful. Now, if you do this bend only on one side, like this one here, so you do this bend, what's going to happen to the other side? Basically, it will be distalized. To understand why distalization is going to happen, imagine if you now have this dotted line start to be straight and you insert it into the slot. You will find that this wire will be here. Then what you need to do is to move the wire this way and engaging the slot again. So that will result in distalization of the molar on one side and correction of the rotation of the molar on the other side. However, about the efficiency of this in distalization, we don't have a strong evidence saying that you get a lot of distalization by this technique. And when you use as well, we're still talking about the TPA, or sometimes you can use the same principle with the quad helix, and I consider this part very important. Now, if you apply simply a one-point force application to this, let's talk about this paragraph. You have this TPA, imagine that this is a TPA or a quad helix, and you simply activate this quad helix or TPA to correct the crossbite. Now you are applying the force with a single point of force application away from the center of resistance. That will result in a rotation, right? Because you are applying the force away from the center of resistance, so we're going to get moment of the force. And what's going to happen is that the palatal cusp will be hanging down. Now this can be okay if we don't have an anterior open bite or reduced bite. If you have a reduced bite, this hanging down of the palatal cusp will cause a more severe anterior open bite. So what to do when you are applying the force and you can generate a moment of the force that will move the crown buccally, you need to generate a counter moment that will move the root palatally. That will move the root buccally or move the crown palatally, as if you are applying palatal crown torque to this molar to counteract the proclination or the buccal crown torque that is applied by the TPA. So how to do that is simply do this bend here and this bend here. That will apply a counter moment to cancel the moment of the force. And this is very handy when you are using quad helix in a patient with reduced overbite. So simply use the triple beak plier, you apply this bend here and the same bend on the other side, and when you do the expansion, you are applying the force anterior away from the center of resistance. You're expecting to generate a moment that is in the moment of the force that kind of apply buccal crown torque, but this one, the moment of the force that is generated, the counter moment that is generated by this bending will apply a palatal crown torque that they're going to cancel each other, and the end will be a translational movement without hanging down of the palatal cusp. Now this technique as well can be used to do a unilateral expansion. And how is that? So for example, if we want to do expansion for this side to be more than this side, so we know that tipping movement is much easier than bodily movement. So when we do the expansion, now here in this side, because the force is applied away from the center of resistance, both of them will doing tipping movement. And here, because we applied these bends, both of them will do a bodily movement. Now, we know that the bodily movement is more difficult than tipping movement. So if I want this one to do more expansion, simply I will allow this one for tipping movement, and this one should be a bodily movement. So I'm reinforcing anchorage on this side. So I apply the bend only on one side. That will generate a counter moment that will stabilize this tooth and will make this one moving in a tipping movement. That's a stationary anchorage. The last thing here about the segmental arch mechanics, or the last thing about the determinants force system, that sometimes you need to still use the determinate system and understanding your force. So simply what to do is divide the arch into two segments, segment 1 and segment 2. And then you attach this wire into one of the segments with a rectangular wire, and then you have one single point of force attachment to the anterior segment. By this, you have a determinate force system, and by this you will be able to calculate exactly the direction of the force and the moment of the force. So that will be excellent for the from point of view of calculating and knowing the exact tooth movement. However, the problem with the segmental mechanic that it takes a lot of time during the chair side. You need to do a lot of wire bending to achieve this one, and also when you're using it, it might be distorted when the patient is eating or brushing his teeth. So segmental mechanic, yes, it's good in the sense of knowing exactly what's the amount of the force you're applying, but the problem with it that sometimes it kind of need complexity and greater amount of time to do the bending and the adjustment. And here we come to the continuous force. So we have two types of the forces, either segmental or like many different classification, but one of them segmental and continuous. And the continuous force is something like this. You just apply the force to the teeth. The advantage of this one, it's very simple. You should simply power chain from 6 to 6, power chain from the 6 to 3. That's an easy thing to do. But the problem is that you have multiple couple forces, that the forces system will be too complicated to analyze. So for that reason, some people, they prefer segmental mechanics that will be able to understand the forces exactly. Now, after discussing this and discussing in the previous lecture about the sliding and resistance for sliding, we just need to kind of conclude how the teeth are really moving with the sliding movement. So if you apply force in the tooth, you are applying the force away from the center of resistance. So that will generate a moment of the force. So the tooth will rotate immediately. That rotation will be continuous until the crown of the bracket is contacting the angle, the corners of the bracket contacting the arch wire, as we can see here. So at the beginning, there will be a tipping until the wires contacting the corners of the bracket. And then the sliding will become, we have two couple forces that will result in the sliding movement of the tooth. Okay, and we're going to have binding, as we mentioned in the lecture of resistance of sliding, and then it will stop. So the tooth will jump again from the binding, uprightening and tipping, uprightening and tipping again. So if you're going to divide them into stages, we're going to phase 1. During this phase, the counter moment is less than the moment of the force, because we don't have a couple force. So the tooth will have uncontrolled tipping because of the slot play. Then in phase number 2, in which the tipping movement become controlled, as now we have started establishing the counter movement, the couple force. So the counter movement will be equal or slightly larger than the moment of the force. And because of the wire is rigid, okay, now we're going to have the couple system, and the tooth will move, will kind of be stabilized, and it will not tip anymore. Now then you're going to have phase 3, in which the bodily movement will start and the teeth will move in a bodily movement. Now after the bodily movement shift or space closure is finished, you keep the rectangular wire to the point that the counter moment is more than the moment of the force itself, and here become the torque expression of the bracket. Now these are a couple of effects, like Bushinger effect, which basically, or Bushinger effect. The wire will be more flexible if it's bended in the same, or the elastic property will be greater if the wire is bended in the original direction of it's bending. So basically you have the coil spring here, it's bended in this direction. So if it's used in the same direction, in the same movement, so you can see here the canine is moving in the same direction of the coil, of the bending of the coil. So that will result in a more elastic properties. So as you can see, if now the wire is moving in this direction, the crown is moving in this direction, and when the coil is made in this direction. So that will give it more elastic properties. The second effect, we have the wagon wheel effect. So what is the story? If you apply labially crown torque to the incisor, what's going to happen? The crown will torque. So the crown will go labially and the roots will go palatally. But what's going to happen? When they are going palatally, the roots will be closing to each other. They will move towards each other. We call this the wagon wheel effect because it's similar to the wagon wheel. Now Andrews, when he studied the tip and the torque, he said when you're adding 4 degrees of the palatal torque, which palatal root torque, you will be losing 10 degrees of the tip because the crown are going distally at that stage. Third effect is the roller coaster effect, and it happens if you do space closure on a night-eye arch wire, in mass retraction on a night-eye arch wire, because it's not rigid enough. So what's going to happen? We're going to have bend in the middle here. The gable bend, it's a bend that is used when the closing loops mechanics are used. So basically it's going to be like to counteract, to have like a negative counter moment, to counteract the moment that is generated by space closure. So it has 2 arms, the Y, which is anterior to the bend, or the the beta posterior to the bend, and alpha anterior to the bend. And thank you for listening.